This is Lisa from This Jungian Life. We're excited to announce the launch of This Jungian Life Learning, an online educational platform that offers a chance to dive into Jungian topics more deeply. Our first offering will be a 12-month program called Dream School. The three of us will guide you in learning how to interpret your dreams so that you can learn the language of the unconscious. Jung said, "In each of us there is another whom we do not know." He speaks to us in dreams and tells us how differently he sees us from the way we see ourselves. Learning to work with our dreams can help us hear the perspective of this other, leading to an abiding sense of aliveness, renewed creativity, and greater psychological wholeness. Dream work can help us resolve inner conflicts, shift how we approach interpersonal relationships, and help us to find our authentic ground. We're hoping to launch Dream School later on this summer. If you'd like to be one of the first to hear about it, please go to our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the banner link at the top to sign up for our email newsletter. Thank you.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, we are going to talk about animals and the subcategory that most of us have a lived daily familiarity with called pets. But first, I would like to read something that we all have found especially moving about animals. And it is taken from a book called The Outermost House by Henry Beston. And The Outermost House was in Eastham, Massachusetts on Cape Cod. So that's a nice resonance for me personally as well. And here it is. We need another and a wiser and perhaps a more mystical concept of animals. Remote universal nature and living by complicated artifice, man in civilizations surveys the creature through the glass of his knowledge and sees thereby a feather magnified and the whole image in distortion. We patronize them for their incompleteness, for their tragic fate of having taken form so far below ourselves, and therein we err. For the animal shall not be measured by man. In a world older and more complete than ours, they move finished and complete, gifted with extensions of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear. They are not brethren, they are not underlings, they are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and trail of the earth. We all saw that quote, and before I knew where it came from, when we were studying at the Ethical Culture Society, where our Jungian monthly classes were held. And I liked it so much I copied it down, that they are other nations.
Yeah, I love that too. And it does capture something of the magic of animals.
Yes.
I mean, I think I find that as I get older, I actually am more entranced, enchanted with all animals, really, but especially pets, and how different they are from us, and yet what good companions they are.
It is really a lived relationship with other. And if we can acknowledge with respect their individuality, their autonomy, their difference, I think it goes a long, long way to also having a relationship and having compassion and a sense of wonder.
So I'm holding the incredible depth and complexity of the relationship between human beings and animals and then the refined, perhaps modern relationship between human beings and chosen pets. And I find myself just imagining in antiquity how amazing animals must have seemed. The few times that I've been out in the forest and come across an animal, or I'm out in the water and come into near contact with a dolphin, and having the eye of that ancient intelligence focused on you really evokes that world of the theriomorphic gods, that the first recorded images of divine creatures were half animal and half human.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That there's something so stunning about, cross-regarding,
Mm-hmm.
an animal and ourselves, that creates often a feeling of awe.
Yeah.
And something in us perhaps wants to enhance that relationship by civilizing one of the emissaries from the animal world. I remember seeing in one of the National Geographic documentaries about cultures in the Amazon, and how young children would naturally tame and turn wild parrots into their pets. And that's something that had been going on for thousands of years.
Oh, that's interesting.
So we have this instinct of civilizing animals and keeping them close, perhaps to try to understand that magic.
Joseph, I like your reference even to that gaze, and I think that dog owners know that, right? You look in your dog's eyes and you can read the expression there, whether it's plaintive or playful. And I had a cat who was really my soul animal for the greater part of 2 decades. And I remember living alone and, hearing a strange sound at night and kind of waking up and sitting up bolt upright, wondering what that was. And she, of course, was always on my bed. And she woke up too, and we locked eyes, like, what was that? We were both there I remember, and it was so comforting to me that she heard it too, and she was having that reaction as well. So there's so much that transpires in the gaze between us and our pets.
There's a really wonderful, I'm going to read something else from, I think it was the New York Times, about the rescue of a whale off the coast of San Francisco. And it says she was entangled in a web of crab trap lines, hundreds of yards of nylon rope that had become wrapped around her mouth, torso, and tail, the weight of the traps causing her to struggle to stay afloat.
Mm.
A rescue team arrived within a few hours and decided that the only way to save her was to dive in and cut her loose. For an hour, they cut at the lines and rope with curved knives, all the while trying to steer clear of a tail they knew could kill them with one swipe. When the whale was finally freed, the divers said, she swam around them for a time in what appeared to be joyous circles. She then came back and visited with each one of them, nudging them all gently as if in thanks. The divers said it was the most beautiful experience they ever had. As for the diver who cut free the rope that was entangled in the whale's mouth, her huge eye was following him the entire time, and he said that he will never be the same. And I used that to head up the final chapter of my Jungian thesis. I found it so moving. This encounter is so emblematic. Really, don't you think of what we find in the consulting room every day in our encounters with others, and how we touch two people together?
If we rest into a Jungian lens regarding this universal awe-filled phenomena, I wonder how we can understand that, how animals and pets evokes such powerful psychological experiences in us. As you were telling the story about the whale, Deb, I was thinking that the whale was experienced as the self.
Oh, absolutely.
And for Jung, the self was synonymous with our concepts of God and the divine and the human spiritual phenomena of imaging the self in innumerable ways from antiquity to modern times.
And I think we find that in our pets. You know, those aspects of wildlife that we can bring into our homes, just like you were talking about, Lisa, and have that connection with. It's a companion, but the otherness of an animal is also a link to something divine. And those theriomorphic gods you were talking about, Joseph, half man, half bird, half man, half dog, all those animal-headed gods. There's a picture of one in one of the caves in Lascaux in France with a bird head.
I agree with everything that both of you have said. And obviously there is a feeling of awe. And the story about the whale is so just incredibly awe-filled. And I think, we can feel a version of that even with our pets. They can inspire awe at times if we let them. And there's this way that I don't want to psychologize it too much. I remember early in my training to become a therapist, I was seeing someone in my internship, and the person was a Vietnam vet who came in and was very distraught because he had to put his dog down. And he was, just so emotional about it. And I was very moved too. And I remember talking about it later in supervision. And my supervisor, I think, kind of wisely invited me to think about what this might be, kind of what might have been projected on the animal, or what this was a kind of, expression of, other than his loss of the animal. Like, what was it kind of standing in for? And was it actually giving expression to losses he'd faced in Vietnam? And yes, of course. But there was this part of me then and now that thinks, and maybe he was just really sad about losing his dog.
Yes. I think the whale down to this Vietnam vet's dog, these are images of our souls. It was his soul animal.
Yes, and it was his dog. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
It wasn't just a projection.
No.
It was a real loss.
Yes, it was.
It was a real loss.
And a real relationship.
And a real relationship.
Yeah.
Yes. Then we put a Jungian lens on something. Yes, of course, we can psychologize something in order to distance ourselves from it. And it's also useful to imagine how these factors move through different levels of the psyche. But the lived, day-to-day, sweet, enthusiastic intimacy, between a pet owner and the creature that they are guarding, taking care of, is sacred.
Yeah, Jung said somewhere, he had this great line about, just because I'm explaining something doesn't mean I'm explaining it away.
Oh, yes, that's great. That's really great.
Yeah, so we are trying to rest into this and sort of explain it more, but we don't want to explain it away or sort of take the magic out of it.
Yeah.
Right? Pets are so extraordinarily important to so many people. I mean, I know I've had one or two pets in my life that have meant a great deal to me.
I think most people have had a relationship to a pet, maybe growing up or in adulthood, and recognize in a very felt way how important and how real that relationship is. And sometimes people do that when they decide to move in together or get married. And that's the first caretaking kind of joint parenting venture that people have, is to get a pet. And how are we going to do this relationship together with this other that is the creature? I wish we had a different name for it than pet. I think that word just implies a kind of patronizing and less than.
Another term that people use is a companion animal. And that is a little better in some ways.
Yeah, it's a little better, but it doesn't do what that first reading from The Outermost House did, which is to acknowledge the otherness, the autonomy, and the gift we are given of being able to relate to something other, and to honor it.
Yeah, I think pets delight us and they make us laugh. They teach us about aging and death. They're kind of endlessly entertaining. They make us feel less alone. I think there are physiological effects when you spend time with a pet. It kind of relaxes you and lowers your blood pressure and good stuff like that when you're just sort of settling into being with your pet. It's they don't judge you. They're usually happy to see you no matter what, depending on what kind of pet you have.
Exactly.
My cat was, I like to think of her as a dog cat, because she would sort of greet you at the door and was very enthusiastic whenever she saw me and would follow me around. So she was one of those cats,
I think they also introduce us to something that is very real. There's a wonderful quote from Jung, and I think he's not talking about pets, but it applies so beautifully, that our relationship with a pet is, quote, practically the only moment in life when we discover things are real. People sometimes live a whole lifetime until they die without having noticed that things are real. They live as if in a world where everything could be changed by shifting the scenery. And I think pets do that for us. They insist on their own reality. They live, they eat, they have their instincts, they relate to us or not. They grow old, they die. And it is an experience of a kind of realness that we cannot totally shape to our own wishes, according to our own ego desires or values. This life takes place as it takes place outside us, and gives us a sense of what our own trajectory is as well, that we are part of nature.
I think what you brought up, Deb, is extraordinary. And I can think back to being a very young child. Maybe I was in kindergarten or first grade, and we had visited some friends that just had a litter of puppies, and just passing the puppies around. We were a circle of kids sitting on the ground. And I think that's quite right, that it really was a first encounter with an other that was so real, so dependent, so vulnerable, and thus really magical. I think that was initiatic. It opened something. It opened a whole category of consideration in me as a child, which of course made pets compelling, and dogs particularly compelling for me.
What comes up for me about this is, and we've used this word magic a bunch of times, but I'm still there wanting to think about what is magical about this. And I think it's this incredible thing that even though, say the difference between humans and horses kind of in an evolutionary terms, I mean, how many, I don't know, millions of years has it been since we've had a common ancestor, or whatever that is. But we can look at an animal like a horse or a dog or a bird and have this kind of instant communication where we understand each other, the sort of interspecies communication. The part of what I think that's about, at least for, I would say, mammals and birds, maybe it's a little different for reptiles or those kinds of pets, but undoubtedly for mammals and birds, what we're responding to are the sort of neurobiological attachment cues. And when we get attached to a pet, it's a very similar process of attaching to another person in terms of the neurobiology of it. And that's kind of the basis of pet ownership in a lot of these cases. Again, I maybe the reptile owners are going to be angry at me for saying this, but I'm not sure that goes on with a snake. but certainly with these other animals, like there is a real attachment of this biological process of chemicals that get released and that kind of thing. I mean, I think I may have told this story earlier on the podcast, but I kept backyard ducks for a little while. And, ducks are very bonded with each other, and they're flock animals. And my little flock was decimated by a raccoon, and I had one duck left. And she was so distressed at being alone. And we had always kind of gotten along, me and Hazel, but boy, did she get attached to me after she lost her flock. And my neighbor told me that when I parked my car and armed the alarm that makes a little beep, Hazel would start going crazy because she knew I was home. And I would go out back and see her, and she would just be so happy to see me, and she would just follow me around. She was attached to me. Mm-hmm. She was attached to me. She was bonded to me. And of course, we get very bonded to our pets, and they get bonded to us. And we become a proxy for their pack or their flock, or, with cats, they kind of treat you like you're their mom, So it's that's what we're doing with pets, is we're acting out these very primal, ancient attachment behaviors. And it's a remarkable thing that we can do that with an animal who in effect is in some ways so different from us, but it kind of shows us how much we're the same.
I'm thinking of a quote from Jung in Symbols of Transformation, where he writes, "Emotional manifestations are based on similar patterns and are recognizably the same all over the earth. We understand them even in animals, and the animals themselves understand each other in this respect, even if they belong to different species."
Yeah, that's great.
So at that level of emotional patterning, just as you were saying, Lisa, joy at seeing the fellow, the flock mate, and attachment and wanting company and not wanting to be lonely.
Yeah. It's archetypal.
It's archetypal, it's universal. And that animals also have complexes, by the way.
Yeah.
Anybody who's owned a dog, it's clear that the dog's experiences are organized around complexes, that whether it's hearing the jingle of your keys, and the dog has a collection of associations around the front door is going to be open and it's time to leave. That's a complex. It's like the key complex, or the go for a walk complex.
It's not Pavlovian conditioning, Joseph.
Well, I think Pavlov probably was talking about complexes. He just didn't imagine the psyche in the same way. But conditioning is basically a complex. It's a collection of memories around an archetypal core.
Yeah, that trigger us to respond in a certain way.
Absolutely.
So I'm really thinking that pets train us to appreciate both relationship and what we can share, and otherness and how we're different. And I'm thinking about sort of an imaginal continuum from dog to cat to reptile, that dogs are very relational. Cats are a little less relational. They love, and they also have such a great sense of entitlement.
Deb, just some cats are not very relational.
So some more than others, and then something like a snake or a lizard, I think teaches us to appreciate the otherness.
Yes.
Sorry, but I think snakes are pretty non-relational and kind of low wattage animals.
The snake owners are going to not like this episode.
I have to say, to legitimize my opinion, that I have a relative who has always had reptiles. And I don't have any squeamishness about it, but I have yet to feel that any of those reptiles gave 2 cents about either their owner or certainly not me.
Yeah. there was a news article some years ago about a snake owner. I guess it was a constrictor, and he came home with a bag of fried chicken, and the snake smelled it, and it smelled really good. I mean, I'm laughing, but I think the snake killed him. You know, not because he was trying to kill his owner, but because he just smelled the fried chicken. And so, yeah, there talk about a lack of relationality
and the power of instincts that
right.
is true about human beings and all woodland creatures.
Mm-hmm.
That when the instincts are powerfully roused, that the ego or that civilized part just gets put aside, and the instincts just take control.
I have a biologist friend who says that those instincts are either sex or lunch. And I think that's what happened in your story, Lisa. That owner with the fried chicken became lunch.
So I'm noticing that we're enjoying this heartfelt, emotional connection to pets and to animals. That's certainly been my experience. I had a little dog that every morning I would hear his nails click on the wood floor, and then he's a tiny little dog. He'd pop up on the edge of the mattress and stare in my face to see if I was awake yet. And very kindly, if I pinned my eyes shut, because of course I could hear him, he would leave me alone and then go back and sleep for a few more hours.
Yeah, see, that's the difference between cats and dogs.
Very sweet. So, yeah. I mean, it's really great to just stay with all those good feeling stories. And yet, I'd also like to suggest that we transition into a little more of a theoretical lens, using some more Jungian concepts around this, and all the various symbolic meanings that we often and simultaneously attribute to pets and animals, which we talk about in our dream analysis and our use of the analytic lens.
So it's a more distanced or more objective stance that we're moving into right now. And I'm thinking about all the things that we project onto pets. When my daughter saved up for and bought a Siamese cat in 6th grade, she became its mother.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that projection of being the parent, and this cat became her child.
Mm-hmm.
And the cat had certain needs. It needed petting, and it needed a special kind of food. It was like having a doll or a stuffed animal amped up to some much greater degree. But that was a projection, and I think many people have that onto their pets.
Well, one of the things that's pretty common, right, is that people bring in dreams about their pets. And again, if you have someone bring in a dream about their dog, that is a very different dream than a dream about just any dog or a dream about the dog that they had in childhood. I mean, I know that I am the owner of a bird, and he populates my dreams fairly frequently. And I always wonder, what is he carrying for me? What are the projections that I have on him? And it's something like, I think a lot of times our pets in our dreams, they carry some kind of tender, innocent part of us that requires care and tending.
I think in some of the studies around masculine psychology, many men have said that the single most important preparation for caring for an infant was initially caring for a pet, and particularly a dog. That there is something about the pet as child evokes a tremendous amount of sensitivity, attentiveness, conscientiousness, a certain level of attachment that we need, particularly as men perhaps, opportunities to bring that forward.
Well, it gives us access to a different part of ourself. It cracks open the persona and allows us to relate to different levels of our own psyche with greater vulnerability.
And safely, because this pet really does require the tenderness and the caring, and everybody kind of understands that and colludes in it, of whether it's a man or a woman saying, oh, come here, Muffy, come here, tell me what it is. Oh, I think Muffy's hungry. It's very safe to play that out in the context of a pet. And it's not always so safe to play it out. You can't play it out in the workplace, and it's even a little more difficult to play it out with a partner. The pet gives us a venue for expressing those feelings.
When you were using the phrase, play it out, I was also just thinking about play in general and the way that dogs, particularly, I'm more familiar with that, will really insist on play. I remember my little dog from years ago, when he was just really, really rambunctious, he would run across the room, look at me, and then he would rear up and he'd pounce on my foot, and then he'd run away. And he wanted to play tag. I mean, it was just extraordinary.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not a lot of opportunities, particularly as a middle-aged and aging man, to be pulled into a game of tag.
There's a way that we can be completely undefended around our pets.
Mm-hmm.
The defenses drop, the persona drops, and we can just be in a very vulnerable way with our pets.
So the way pets can be perceived as our children and then also evoke the spirit of child in ourselves, and we become a fellow child, playing and romping, snuggling, being a little bit carefree. I'm also thinking how pets, particularly dogs, will take on a maternal complex. And there's a lot of sensitivity to the way a dog, particularly a shepherd, by the way, will take a parenting and protective role towards young children. It's very, very decisive.
Mm-hmm.
And the canine as mother is something also that shows up in popular culture. I was thinking as we were preparing this about Peter Pan.
Yes.
And how the children who are asleep in the nursery have this big, I think it might even be a German shepherd, that they called Nana. And they just had like a little nurse's cap on its head. And, Nana was their overseer and their tender and their soother.
Yeah, I have to say she was not a German shepherd.
What do you think she was?
She was a big, like, sheepdog or something.
Ah, okay.
Oh, she was in Newfoundland.
She a Newfoundland. Yeah. So she was enormous. Newfoundlands are like the size of ponies, Huge dog.
She was the maternal figure, right? Like Wendy's actual mother is very childlike herself and has no idea what's going on with the kids. And it's Nana who is the protector.
I was also thinking about clients who've come in over the years who have had terrible deprivations in childhood, either by circumstance or by the failures of their parents. And the affection and tending and companionship of a dog was the primary source of affection and gentleness and mothering, in a sense. And then the image of the dog looms very, very large in the psyche in a very positive way because the associations are positive, but also the mother complex becomes very limited because the scope of expressiveness of the tending dog is much less than a high functioning mom.
Mm-hmm.
So there's still an inner process to mature the mother complex beyond the instinctive mother.
So pets can contain for us an image of the positive mother, of the self, of our traumatized self that needs tending and care.
Yes.
It can feel very sacred, the bond that we have, because it does outpicture also a relationship with ourselves.
Now, speaking about the traumatized self, often in dreams, people who have been traumatized will dream of a wounded pet or a wounded creature.
Yes. I have a dream from way back going into an apartment, and the dream ego sees a cat that is almost dead. And the name of the cat is Mr. Childers. Get it? And here's this yellow cat on the floor, and the dream ego is stricken with sorrow and anxiety and all the things we can imagine, and quickly goes to supply food and drink for this dream image of the wasting away, starving cat. And that is a perfect image of what you were talking about, Joseph, of the part of the self that is being imaged as this neglected animal that needs to be tended, rescued, fed, cared for. It's a real shadow image of what that dreamer, what's going on in that dreamer's psyche, or part of what's going on.
I've seen a complicated dynamic constellate in that projection of the traumatized self. I'm thinking of, this was a friend who had a particularly complicated and heartbreaking trauma history, who had first purchased and then adopted abandoned animals and had, quite a crew of creatures. And part of the projection of her traumatized self on the animals is that they were always just a step away from disaster. And she had such an incredible amount of anxiety about whether they were safe or happy, whether they were eating right, that when I would go over and visit, the dogs were unbelievably anxious.
Mm-hmm.
The dogs were kind of moving around the house, staying close to the walls, kind of creeping up to strangers, that the projection we put onto the creature and then we reinforce with behavior shapes a complicated response system that's not always beneficent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Our pets feel the weight of our projections, I think.
And they can become kind of narcissistic extensions of ourselves.
Mm.
If we forget that they are other and they have their own needs and desires and personalities, but that we want them to mirror us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to be what we want them to be, what we need them to be.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people will, can get angry at an animal who is not fulfilling that function.
Yeah, I've definitely seen this with someone who's, very narcissistic and has a dog and projects all of this stuff on the dog, like, oh no, the dog's not hungry or whatever. And meanwhile, the image that the outsider gets of how this dog is being treated is just, with terrible cruelty. But the owner is just really unable to see it. And how this woman treats her dog is very much a mirror of how she treats others in her life and even how she treats herself.
I've seen a lot of scolding behavior towards pets, as if the pet is willfully being disobedient and or can really understand these, complicated criticisms that are being delivered to them. And what's often painful is it seems to be a repetition of the way that the owner was parented.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard.
Yeah.
That's hard to see.
Yeah. And again, I think it often also pictures that relationship with ourselves. So if we're tending to our animals well, we are probably also tending to ourselves okay too. And that's, I think, why often, people's dreams of their pets often focuses on, I'd forgotten to close the door and the dog got out and was about to run into the road, or the bird flew out the open door. And it's like, so where am I not tending to something? Where have I let my attention to my own psyche slip? So something is not being adequately cared for.
And sometimes that can be part of the projection that people think their pets are more autonomous, more intelligent, more capable, more human than is accurate.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about pet loss and what a big deal that is for many people, and how often that shows up in the consulting room over the course of working with someone in analysis. To have to put a dog or a cat down after years and years of steady companionship, and how wrenching that decision is, how really upsetting it is, what a great loss it is, and the sense of responsibility we may feel if we did have to make a decision to put it down. It's a difficult loss to process in a way, because sometimes we wonder about its legitimacy. So that if we lose a parent, for example, we're met with everyone around us being, very understanding and expressing sympathy. But if we're just devastated because we've lost a beloved animal, we may not feel the same sense of entitlement to other people's understanding and sympathy. We may not ask for it. We may not receive it.
And it's very real. I'm thinking about a cat that we had for 20 years, and that cat held the history of our family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's very close to home, because this summer we had to put down our son's dog.
Mm.
And my goodness, our oldest granddaughter marked the time of her life from age 4 to her early 20s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's more than just a sort of symbolic container for family history and marking so many of the passages of life for everybody in the family. There is a very vivid reality to this relationship in and of itself. If you have known a person for 20 years or 18 years, that's a long time.
Well, and your pet has kind of traveled with you that whole road,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
We were all very different people 20 years ago, no matter what, most likely. And when you lose a pet, it is like the end of a chapter.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's a very real loss that needs time just to have those feelings be felt.
There's something about the pet never graduating beyond its dependence on you that creates a tremendous feeling of responsibility, of course, for all decisions. I think that if we look to human adults that we know in our lives who become ill or come into a misfortune or at the end of their life, because we understand that they are conscious of what's happening, they're autonomous, they're participating in decisions, that of course it's sad to us, but the level of responsibility around the outcome is, of course, different. And so when I was thinking about, and eventually did put down my dog, my really beloved dog, that sense of making a decision like that, and also the desperate hope that the dog would signal to me that it was ready to go. This fantasy that the responsibility would be taken out of my hands and then he would tell me he's ready to go. How much I wanted that to be true so that I didn't have to bear a responsibility for that moment.
Joseph, I wonder if you could tell the story that you shared earlier about
Marion Woodman?
Yeah.
Yeah, I I had an opportunity many, many years ago to act as a bit of a chauffeur for Marion Woodman. She was visiting Virginia Beach and visiting a friend in Virginia Beach. And they just needed somebody, a volunteer, to drive her about an hour and a half away to an airport. So I had
You
the
lucky
privilege.
dog.
Yeah, right. I was young, so I didn't really even understand the opportunity. So, I'm just sitting there chatting away. Marion was telling a lot of stories and, sharing a lot of her wisdom to me as a young man. And at some point, she told a story. I don't even know how we came upon it, but talking about pets. And then she said that in her first analysis, she came in and just mentioned offhandedly to her analyst that her beloved pet had died, and she was just moving deftly through it, moved on to another topic lightly. And the analyst burst into tears, started really weeping in the session, and said to her, "That was your soul pet, your soul animal." And she says that in that moment, something was transferred from the analyst to her that evoked this enormous capacity for intense feeling. And she said, that was the moment when my analysis began.
Yeah. So animals help us access our feeling function.
Yes. They help us get attached when we've had to sever feeling of tenderness and so on, including to ourselves. That's such a great story.
That's a great story.
Of the reconnection with feeling.
And if our hearts have been hardened for whatever reason, I mean, there are many stories of someone's heart being melted, softened by a relationship with an animal. There's lots of stories about it, and I think we've all seen that and perhaps even known it too.
I think we do know it. We all know it somewhere in ourselves. There's that wonderful scene in the original Incredible Journey. I mean, nobody can watch that film without sobbing of the reuniting at the end of these animals that travel across the country to find their owners. We know it.
So we were looking to find out what Jung's relationship with pets was, and we had a little trouble, but I found it in Barbara Hanna's book, Jung and His Work. And Jung had a dog named Yogi, and Barbara Hanna writes that this was Jung's faithful friend for many years and died at the unusually old age of 19, asleep in his basket one night during World War II. And she has a great story about the very first time that she met Jung. I guess she was a relatively young woman, and she had come from Paris, where she was living at the time, to Switzerland. And she was waiting in the waiting room, and he comes out. She provides a long description of her first impressions. And then she says, when he came to fetch me from the waiting room, he held his pipe in his hand and was accompanied by his large gray schnauzer dog, who was evidently used to drawing his own conclusions about the people who came to see his master. And she talked about the enormous, powerful impression that Jung had on her. And then she says, considerably shattered by these strong impressions, I bent down to pat the dog until I was recalled by Jung asking dryly, did you come from Paris to see the dog or me? I like to imagine that scene.
And I think everyone knows, too, that Freud had chow chows, these great big furry dogs. And he, I think, felt somewhat differently from Jung about their use as assistants or co-therapists in the consulting room, and that they could often serve as a way to help people open up, that it was safer to relate to the animal than it might be to Freud right at the outset. So they seem to function as kind of transitional objects, opening up and feeling safe.
In this category of pets as transitional objects, I think we're just leaning into the whole category of emotional support animals. And how do we understand this trend in the culture? I think that we have always used pets as emotional support animals. I think that's one of the reasons we love our pets, that they affect us positively. But this feeling of the pet becoming a transitional object that then is integrated into the functioning of the psyche in a very literal way versus an imaginal way is powerful. You know, I think was it Winnicott who coined that term, and he noticed that very young children, as they're transitioning away from the mother, will become very, very attached to a teddy bear or a blanket, and they will invest the object with a tremendous amount of emotional potency and ascribe to the, let's say, the blanket, the power to soothe them, to protect them, to companion them. And then over time, what's invested in the blanket is integrated into the psyche. So eventually we find the blanket out in the backyard, or it returns to a less charged status. So when we imagine all of that need for soothing projected onto a pet, and then feeling that the pet cannot leave us, or else we will be unbelievably anxious and unable to manage ourselves, is really in that category of transitional objects.
Yeah, there's probably a continuum, isn't there, of from that kind of projection all the way to more of a separation and a real relationship with the animal. But that we may start by needing to have that external creature to project parts of ourselves onto, and to touch and hold and pet, until we can mature into integrating some of those functions into ourselves.
So I'm thinking about how pets help us hold things, and specifically how they help us hold a kind of right relationship with the instincts. I loved actually what they did in Game of Thrones, where each of the Stark kids winds up with a wolf as a pet in the beginning. And then how they treat that wolf often presages what becomes of them. So I can't remember what Sansa does with her wolf, but somehow I think she lets it go, or she sends it back up north or something. And of course, it doesn't really work out well for her, but I'm not going to give an exegesis of that right now, but I think you generally get the gist.
No.
But I do have a couple of fairy tales that address this too. So, and I wanted to pick two because they show very different relationships with pets. Of course, fairy tales are filled with animals, and often magical talking animals, but I've picked two fairy tales that really address pets and dogs very specifically. So the first is a tale from the American South called Wiley and the Hairy Man. And Wiley is a boy who lives with his mother, and his father was disappeared years ago, and they suspect that he was taken by the hairy man. So Wiley's mother says, whenever you go, you need to take your dogs with you. When you go out wandering, take your dogs. And Wiley doesn't have any trouble until one day he leaves the dogs tied up. And then he meets the hairy man. And he's able to outsmart the hairy man because he kind of challenges the hairy man to show off his magical prowess, and says, could you make all the rope in the county disappear? And the hairy man does that. And then the dogs are loosed and they come and they save Wiley. And the fairy tale goes on from there. But there's another fairy tale that's sort of in contradiction to that, which is a really disturbing, kind of wonderfully dark fairy tale called The Hobbyas. There's a little girl who lives in a hut with an old man and an old woman and a dog. The little dog's name is Turpy. And the Hobbyas are these creatures that come, and the Hobbyas come every night, and they say, Hobbyas, 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 tear down the hemp stalks, eat the old man and woman, carry off the little girl. But Turpy barks when the Hobbyas come. Now, the old man gets really irritated by being awakened by Turpy, And he says the next morning, little dog Turpy barks so that I can neither slumber nor sleep. If this continues, I will cut off his tail. So the first night, the old man cuts off the dog's tail. The next night, the Habias come back. Turpy barks again. The old man says, I'm going to cut off one of your legs.
Oh,
So he
gosh.
does. And it goes on like that, one leg at a time, until finally he cuts off the dog's head. And that night, the Habias come and they tear down the hemp stalks and they eat the old man and woman and they carry off the little girl, who is finally rescued by a hunter with a big dog, and the dog devours the Habias. But the first part of that story to me is so poignant because it shows the way that we can cut ourselves off from our helpful instincts, leaving the vulnerable parts of ourselves at risk. And so, and obviously I'm reading it sort of symbolically, the dog as the keeper of our helpful instincts. But I think that can be true too, how we relate to our actual animals, if we sort of listen to what they try to tell us and we respect them. We treat our instincts and our pets with reverence.
And our dreams.
And our dreams.
I have another quote from Jung, perhaps to finish up with. He writes, "In these days, on the other hand, we are becoming very sentimental about animals. Every kind of society for the prevention of cruelty to animals exists, which shows that we are getting more friendly towards our instincts."
Oh, that's great.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
So today's dreamer is a 32-year-old woman who is an artist. She says, "The dream began when I found myself climbing up a steep, snowy ledge on a tall cliff. There was a trail of footsteps as if I had been there before. As I trekked upwards, I contemplated my teenage years of debauchery and the lies I told to keep my mother comfortably unaware. As the cliff's edge got steeper, the snow became much deeper, and I continued on all fours with exhaustion setting in. Upon reaching the top, I almost ate some snow, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude, but quickly realized what a poor decision that could potentially be, thinking of dirty snow. So I let my body sink into an icy cold bed of snow instead, relaxing all my muscles and regulating my breath at the journey's end. It felt gratifying to have reached the top, and the sensation of cold snow felt incredible against my skin. I looked up and noticed a small alcove. Inside, under dark shadows, stirred the silhouette of a large raven, mysterious yet significant, nodding its head toward me as if it had been awaiting my arrival." And here's what she says about the context. She says, "Early that morning, I had been woken up by a phone call from a dear friend. His voice seemed different, sad, and conflicted, but he denied any troubles. I fell asleep and had that dream, which only ended when it did because the buzzing of my phone again woke me up. The second time, it was an unexpected message from another person very dear to my heart. He had sent a recording of a beautiful acoustic song written by himself entitled Shadows." She said the main feelings in the dream were ambitious, familiar, strength, and mystery. And then she says, "I dream of snow and watery landscapes often. It always feels very easy to navigate, also revitalizing, inspiring, and magical. I have lived most of my life in a red sand, hot, hot desert, very much removed from water and snow. I dislike the cold and can hardly swim in my waking life, but in my dreams, it always, without exception, feels like my natural and preferred element.
One theme that seems to emerge in the dream is the completion of a heroic journey and the exhaustion of the ego. We can surmise a number of things about attaining the summit, fighting through snow versus fighting through other kinds of difficult elements. But she does attain the summit. And then in exhaustion, she sinks down into herself, ostensibly. And often only when the ego is exhausted does something transpersonal have the space to emerge in a archetypal and direct way. So the raven being with her in the alcove gives us a sense that something transpersonal has companioned her on the journey. And the raven has a lot of associations, but one is that it's sacred to Odin, which is a Norse god much like Zeus, and gives us a sense that the raven is a theriomorphic symbol of the self that is alert and engaging her. And the journey continues depending on how she is going to respond to this self symbol, which feels very alien to her, being in the form of an animal, but seems highly alert and aware.
Yeah, in Norse mythology, Odin has two ravens. One is named Memory, and the other is named Mind.
I am thinking about all of the imagery around snow and how it sort of blankets the earth. It's quiet, it's beautiful, it's cold, and it's a kind of insulating effect on the earth, and maybe insulating from feelings. And I'm thinking about how she begins with finding herself climbing up a steep, snowy ledge on a tall cliff. There's all these images of height and coldness and trek and journey. And she contemplates her teenage years of debauchery and the lies she told her mother to keep her mother comfortably unaware. And I am wondering about the parallel of that to snow, the cover-up.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And what snow may mean in the psyche of this dreamer who, after all, lives in a very hot climate that is where there's never any snow. I'm wondering about the feeling function here and where that may be in the dreamer and how that is in the dream where she lets her body sink into the cold bed of snow and then looks up and sees a raven. So I'm struck by sort of all this natural and kind of archetypal imagery versus relational life and more living or images of living that are closer to ego and natural life.
You know, I think that's really interesting, Deb, what you said about snow. And the one thing I would say is that, especially as contrasted with a desert environment, snow is water. Now, it's frozen water, but she said she also has a lot of dreams about water. So in terms of the feeling function, snow would represent an ability to a certain presence of water, right? It just needs to melt. So it's sort of there. I was really struck by the fact that there's a trail of footsteps as if I had been there before. So this is some place that she's traversed prior. She's attempted this before. Now, maybe she didn't make it to the summit before, but this is something that she's been working on within her psyche. And I too wondered about the reference back to the teenage debauchery. And I like your kind of wondering about the relationship with snow. But it almost feels like there's some kind of coming to terms with. What was that to her, those teenage years, and how has that affected her? And is she feeling remorse? Is this part of what she needs to do on the journey, is confront some kind of unfinished business from that time?
Along those lines, I was thinking about the transition from the hot desert to the cool snow. And when she talks about her teenage years, as we all are, perhaps being hot-headed, being impulsive, being overpassionate, or the word I like to use is hyper-aroused. There's too much heat in the psyche. And so in the dream world, and perhaps even in some level of longing, to be able to just rest into the cool objectivity of the snow and even the objectivity of the mountaintop. And from that very high place, one can look down on the landscape to get a wide view, to get a dispassionate perspective, to get a kind of archetypal lens rather than a personal lens, which might allow her to be more objective and less emotional or hot-headed about things, even including past mistakes or things that she feels remorse about.
Yeah, and I think that the raven fits in with that interpretation, right? Because they can kind of carry this quality of wisdom or even foreseeing the future. So I think that I like that, Joseph. I like that a lot.
I think I'm building on what you're saying, using a slightly different lens, the lens of, from a feeling function place of remoteness. Of the snow maiden is cool. She's white. There's a purity, but not accessible. And I'm thinking about the raven is also remote. In her dream, he's inside dark shadows. And of course, is a bird. So birds fly and they too are not, contactful. So I'm thinking about maybe that's it. She's reached the top and she has this lens through which to see things as if from a psychological or emotional distance, with a kind of clarity.
And she had to work hard to get there.
Yeah. I'm still wondering about the feeling function.
Yeah, no, I hear that. I want to say, though, she had to drop to all fours. So as you pointed out right in the beginning, Joseph, there is a kind of lowering of the ego. It's been dethroned a little bit. If you have to crawl on all fours, you've surrendered a bit, I think, to your ego position, your ego dominance.
Yeah. And I wonder also, maybe the flip side is there something hot in her that needs the cooling function of the snow, where she says she lets her body sink into the snow, relaxing her muscles. Something completed where it has been cooled off.
And we would think about that as a compensatory activity of the dream.
Yeah.
If we think about that cooling off, and I think about the raven, I find myself thinking about Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven. A lot of things could be said about the raven, but the raven represents this relentless, confrontive voice that just constantly says, nevermore, nevermore.
It's making the narrator of the poem confront the finality of death and loss.
Yes, that the lost Lenore, nevermore. Is there a balm in Gilead, he asks. The quote says, nevermore. And so there's something existential about the raven that casts all of the realities of the life back onto the author without any kind of sentimental escape or any kind of fantasy material. And although that is an excruciating experience for all of us, it brings us back to the idea that reality is medicinal. And as she is doing this life review about perhaps what she feels to be her misspent youth, that there is a raven-like objectivity and directness about the truth and the demand to orient to the truth without evasion.
And I think it may also be a demand to orient toward shadow. The raven is in dark shadows, and the friend who sent her a beautiful acoustic song, the song was entitled Shadows. As such a contrast of the brilliant, cold whiteness of snow, that's often related to sort of frozen feeling function, and this black, living, magical, mystical, sort of shamanic bird, the raven. The black and white of it is an unmissable color contrast that may be an image of her emotional dynamic, or her the relationship between her emotions, especially her emotion to shadow, of the cold white objectivity of snow compared to the shadow of the raven.
It's a really interesting dream.
Very interesting dream.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.